what we're doing is, what do Australians think of Christianity and the church? We've got a PowerPoint happening. Fantastic. Can you put on that one as well? No, you can't. No problem. I can see mine here. So we want to look at this idea of what Australians think of Christianity and church. And this slide here is partly why everybody thinks that the church is dying and we're in terrible trouble. And so everybody who's sort of the more the atheistic end of our community does the whole, well, yes, this just demonstrates how bad the church is going. This is the results from the last census. And you'll notice in the last census, we're down to this gap being quite small here between Christianity and no religion. And the intriguing thing is that this didn't change till the mid-1960s. So keep in mind that in 1911, one of the first censuses that occurred, 96% of people ticked a Christian box in Australia. 96%. So that didn't actually change to the mid-1960s, which is kind of interesting for a number of reasons. One is, which again is, I'll get at this in the next session. One is this idea that, well, you know, we were started by a bunch of convicts, the dregs of England, sent to Australia. We were secular from the beginning because they're all a godless bunch. Somebody described Sydney in those days, the New South Wales colony, as hell on earth. And that just demonstrates that we're just a secular, godless bunch and nobody is really interested in Christianity at all, or faith, or the whole religion thing. And yet, you do a census 120 years later, and 96% of the people in this country tick a Christian box. There's more than just sort of cultural heritage going on there. And there was a notion that Australia was settled as an evangelical experiment. I'll come back to that at some point. And you'd have to say in a lot of ways, in 1950, that the evangelical experiment was actually doing pretty well. Now, certainly that's changed. And it's changed clearly through this period of time. Was a huge shift. In the 1960s and 70s and into the 80s, and then you gained a whole bunch of, as somebody else said, you know, who's got the microphone now? And the people who have the microphone now, as in the cultural elites, commentariat, they make a very big noise about the fact that Christianity is dead. It won't be long before we finally bury this thing, and won't that be a good thing? One of the questions is, this notion of no religion, and I want to make a point about this because we've done research as Olive Tree Media, which is this tiny little group, but we've done research in 2011, 2016 and 2021. And that research was, what do Australians think of Christianity and the church? This, by the way, this presentation is the graphics are going to change several times because I'm using material from like 4 different groups of research. So there's our research, NCLS research, some research from the UK as well. And so we're looking at all different sorts of research. And one of the things that we'd seen is that people who identify as Christians sat around the 40 to 45% rate since 2011. So all that's happening now is the census is catching up to what we've sort of always known, but it's taken a huge leap. Now, technically, if I can just say, a couple of reasons it's taken a huge leap. One is that in the 2016 census, they actually shift the no religion box to the top of the census options. So that, rather than that being the bottom of the options in that question, they moved it to the top. Be under no illusion, there's a whole bunch of agendas being pushed here. Secondly, for the last 2 censuses, there's been a campaign to tick the no religion box. Now you think about that, it's pretty bizarre, isn't it? Imagine a whole bunch of people out there campaigning for people to stop ticking a religion box. And so it's a kind of an intriguing thing. Also, if you remember the census, because you do, don't you? No, of course you don't. You don't remember the census. It is the worst question in the world, the question on religion. I mean, there's no religion, and then there's like Catholic, Anglican, Buddhist, Baptist, other. Like and they've just kept this question the same, but it's a really poorly worded question. So, but essentially what we're getting is closer to what is reality. One of the things we need to ask is, So this is our research, and we don't have a nice little graphic on this, but on our research, now this was done in April 2021, so this is only just last year. This was our 2021 research, and you'll see that Orthodox Christian, I'll point to this one as well, just so you people don't feel bad. So this one has 46% of people who recognise some sort of Christian faith in their life. Now, there's another question I'm going to show you later where we say to people, so do you call yourself a Christian? And only 38% of people tick that box. So now the point is you can't send your surveys back to people and go, listen, you're inconsistent in your answers. Can you get those right? Like that doesn't happen. The people are inconsistent. But essentially what you have is that there's a bit of a shift between people who kind of say, yes, we sort of see ourselves as Christian, and they sort of identify, but they don't actually, they identify with Christianity as general, but they don't necessarily say, I am a Christian. That is actually slightly different within the research. You'll see that those who say, I'd prefer not to identify with any Christian in this is 32%, and then there's 12% that have spiritual beliefs. Now, we did this for McCrindle research, and each time we've done it in 11, 16 and 21, that remained a bit the same. This slide is actually from the NCLS, National Church Life Survey. And I did a webinar with Ruth Powell and their team when they released this research. Now, the intriguing thing here is there's this sort of, more than half Australians believe in God and a higher power, but of these statements, which comes closest to your belief? Now, you'll see that this is really an interesting piece, isn't it? So you've got it almost split kind of in quarters, not quite. But you've got, I don't believe there's any sort of God or spiritual life. There's a personal God. Now, we would, as a Christian, we would see that as our answer, I would think. There is some sort of spirit or force of life. I don't really know what to think. So what all this is saying is, when you see a census outcome that says 39% of Australians have no religion, totally godless in their thinking, how terrible, look where our country is, it's not quite as clear as that. And in fact, Rodney Stark, who I quoted last night, has done research in America where he's researched, okay, if you tick a no religion box, what do you actually believe? And he's researched to those group of people. They believe an enormous amount, not about Christianity, but about all sorts of spiritual parts of life, and also, you know, there's a whole bunch of deism that's going on there. So what often happens when people say that they don't identify with any religion, what they're actually saying is, I don't identify with institutional religion. And they want to be spiritual in some sort of way. Now, that doesn't mean to say there aren't a growing number of people that are kind of atheistic and kind of a bit militant in their atheism. That's true. But the idea that we're a godless country and nobody goes to church anymore and nobody believes anymore, that's not anywhere near the truth. I want you to notice this little box down the bottom here, believe in God or a higher power. Down here, this little box here, look at these numbers. Now, I know these screens are small and you're looking at, you're kidding, Karl? I can't see that. This is like a test for your driving licence. Essentially, there is another narrative that we're told often, which is the next generation don't believe anything. And, it's only the builders and the boomers, they're the ones that have belief, and the next generations don't actually believe anything, and it's a terrible place for the church. Interestingly, probably the most godless group within the community are the boomers. They are the most unspiritual, godly and militant. White boomer men are probably the most militant in the community. And many of them are commentators in our media, but moving on. 18 to 34% believe in God and a higher power, 57%, at 59 in the middle, and then you get the kind of boomers, 49, and then the boomers are mixed between there, and 56%. All we're saying is, down here, there's still opportunity and there's still belief. Here's a graph of church attendance, and again, this points at this thing that nobody's going to church. And when you see the census, people basically commentate on the census and say, see, the census is showing that churches are dying and it won't be long and we'll close them all down. Certain churches are dying. Certain denominations are doing really badly. And in the last census in Sydney, they did an analysis of the last census in Sydney, the 2021 census, and those who identified as Anglican dropped about 17%. Those who identified as Catholic dropped the same. The biggest drop was the Uniting Church at 20%, who identified in the census as being Baptists, grew by 2%. So, it's not all bad news. But even in the midst of that, church attendance, as you can see on this scale, now who knows whether that figure in 2020 is an outlier? We don't really know, because you get an outlier figure and which doesn't fit the trend. But essentially, McCrindle and NCLS are saying the same thing about church attendance in Australia. Over the last 15 years, it's sat steady at about 15 to 16%. Now, keep in mind, that's a percent, it's not a number. So as a percentage of the population who say they attend church, sits at about 15 to 16%. Keep in mind this, when people say Christians shouldn't be a part of the political process, separation of church and state, churches shouldn't have a part of the political process, more people attend church than are part of a union movement. And the union movement has a huge influence on the Labor Party. And nobody questions that. But from a sheer weight of numbers, there are more people. Now, the trouble is they're split across the political spectrum and none of us want that to happen anyway. But here's my point is that it is a significant number of people within the community, even if it's not as large as it used to be. Here's the frequency of attendance, and what they're saying in NCLS, this is again the NCLS, there's this notion of this, it seems to have jumped up to so in 1920 you had a drop because of the COVID numbers, and then we've jumped back to the pre-COVID numbers. So, but the intriguing thing about this is, so 2 in 10 Australians went to church, but look at the bottom layer. So 3 in 10 18 to 34-year-olds have tried church in the last number of years. So you actually have a group of people in this group that people are saying, there's not really an opportunity there, they're not going to church, they don't really care about faith and commitment. There's a higher number of them that are trying church than the overall mix across the whole of the nations. Just to emphasise that COVID has been tough for the church, tough for people like Adam, tough for church leaders across the country. There's this, in church leadership, I think, Sean, this is true in every part of life, but in church leadership there's this overwhelming sense of tiredness across Australia for church leaders dealing with COVID, especially in places like Sydney and in Melbourne. A really difficult period of time. But COVID turns out that it could actually be an opportunity for the gospel and the church. And McCrindle have done research, and it's talking about COVID-19's Australians spending more time doing this. 40% said they spent more time thinking about the meaning of life, 47%. 47% thinking about their own mortality. Can you read? They're pretty small, aren't they? Sorry about that. 33% thinking about God and 28% praying. In fact, there was international research done out of Copenhagen, I think it was, I can't remember who did it, and they watched Google searches on particular words across the globe to see what people are focusing on. So one way to kind of ask what people are focusing on is to look at what they've Googled searched. The Google search for praying at the beginning of the COVID pandemic grew exponentially as a COVID Google search. So there is this notion that life is a little unsure. We're not sure about the future. We're not sure about our health. In that situation, faith, spirituality and belief becomes more and more important. And what we see within Australia is potentially in the younger age bracket, there is this sense of leaning into faith and belief. And how do we respond to that? There's population growth and slowdown, but 38% through natural increase, but 62%, this is through McCrindle, through net migration. And we did this, it was in 2021. This was April 2021. Now, Australia is a nation made up of immigration. The only people that didn't immigrate here, or their forebears, were the First Nations people. The rest of us are all immigrants, or we're children of immigrants, even if it's a few generations ago. Immigration has made this country the way it is. And just to keep in mind, so Australia has twice as many residents born overseas than the UK or the US. It's remarkable, isn't it? So in Australia, 29% of Australians were born somewhere else, not in this country. If you go to the UK, it's only 14%. If you go to America, it's only 14%. So that the notion of being born overseas and coming to Australia is really important. Where's the most common immigrant nation? Where do people come from? Well, interesting, the shift, which is a shift over the last few years, is India and China. So India and China are where most of our immigration comes from. Intriguing, when we made the series Faith Runs Deep, which I'll show you the trailer in a minute, later in the next session, we drove around Australia. And driving through regional towns, you recognise how much of this is influencing not just the cities, but regional cities. I don't know what it's like in Toowoomba, but everywhere we went, we were served, this is not a complaint, this is just a observation, and they're wonderful people. They're working incredibly hard. But the number of people, especially from the subcontinent, in country towns all over this country is a remarkable number. Now, one of the big changes, and then the next thing is all the other places that they come from. One of the things that McCrindle says, and we reflected on, is you could create a story that says, well, you know, India and China are both countries that don't have Christianity as the majority faith of the nation, and if most of our immigration is not coming from nations where people come from a Christian framework, then that will change the fabric of who we are as a people. And that's a reasonable argument. But the intriguing thing is what we'll see in this a little bit later, is that those born overseas are more likely to lean into faith and belief and religion than those born here. So while we can say, oh, there's more people coming from nations that aren't Christian, therefore that will shift our nation, maybe not as much as you think. So therefore, look, what I'm just saying is on that point. So the percentage identifying with no religion. So if you were born in Australia, 35% said no religion. If you were born overseas, it dropped to 21%. So in other words, that's a shift of 1.7 times. So you are more likely to identify with faith if you were born overseas. And the intriguing thing is, they're going back to that Tim Booker, who I talked to in the first service. He's now at Liverpool, but before that he was at Guildford, which is an area which is dominated by the Arabic population. And I said, what's it like leading a church in that area of the Arabic population of Australia? And he said, well, the Arabic population in Sydney are split 50-50 between Muslims and Mennonites. 50% of the Arabic population in that area actually come from a Christian background. So there's a whole bunch of sweeping generalisations we can make that may not actually be accurate. We asked questions about significant days. So what are the most significant days in our calendar? What days do you think are more important in our calendar? Now this is sort of getting at what matters most to Australians. So what matters most to Australians is the days that they identify with. And intriguingly, at the top are the 2 days in relation to war and sacrifice for our nation. Anzac Day is number 1 at 83%, and Remembrance Day is number 2 at 77%. So here's this intriguing notion of, and I think what I found surprising was not Anzac Day, because Anzac Day is always sort of lived on in, so it's high in our consciousness, isn't it, Anzac Day? We think about Anzac Day quite a bit. I don't know about you, but I almost have to remind myself that it's Remembrance Day. And yet, within the culture, within the psychological nature of our culture, these days are important. But notice that Christmas Day and Easter still sit very high on this list. Now, we actually asked about grand finals and Pride Day and all sorts of other days. They weren't nearly as important, and Christmas Day and Easter sit very high as important days within Australia. But this is also influenced by your age bracket. One of the questions we asked was about National Sorry Day. And National Sorry Day was quite further down the list. But look at the difference between if you were Gen Z or if you were a builder. Builders are sort of now is probably over 75. For builders in Australia, National Sorry Day doesn't really hit their psyche. That's not a criticism, it's just an observation. And only 11%. Gen Z, 50% saw it as important. So you could suggest that if we kept doing this for another 20 years, those numbers would shift quite dramatically. We want to ask this question about, and I guess I know this is really small, so I'm going to have to explain it a bit to you. We asked a question about, so if you're not a Christian, how close are you to the Christian faith? There was this thing, if you've been around churches for a long time and people thinking about evangelism and gospel ministry for a long time, you might remember a thing called the Engels scale. And it was come up by a guy called Dr. Engels, and he was basically, the premise of what he was thinking was, you're not like either a Christian, and if you're not a Christian, you're an angry atheist. A long way from the kingdom of God or the things of faith. But that just belies common sense, doesn't it? So the question is, so he came up with this scale, sorry, I finished that off. He came up with this scale of 0, became a Christian, -7 was as angry atheist as you can get. And then he's got a scale of growth in discipleship as well. So we want to look at this 0 to -7. So the question we were asking with McCrindle to work with us on is, so where do people sit? So the first question is, I consider myself a Christian. There are two numbers there. One is 37 and one is 38. 37%, the top, so you can see right in the top corner, the top number is in 2021, the second number is in 2017. So here we're looking at what's the shift in this period of time. Is there a shift, and what's the shift? So again, here's this blunt, direct statement. I consider myself a Christian. 37%, 38%. So it's not really shifting. Now, the next, so we split this into three groups. People who are warm, people who are kind of neutral, and people who are cold. So here's the question that they were asked. I'm going to, if you could read it, the really good people, the people with great eyesight will be able to read this. I'll just read it to you. -1 is, I believe in Christianity, but don't consider myself a Christian. Now you got to say, that's pretty close, isn't it? I believe in this. I don't call myself a Christian, but I believe it. The second one, I believe much of Christianity, but still have significant doubts. And -3, I believe in the ethics and values of Christianity, but I do not practice Christianity in any way. So these are the people who actually believe, positively disposed, but don't call themselves a Christian. Then the middle is, I believe Christianity churches should have religious freedoms, but I don't want to be involved. And then you get down to the last three, which are the cold. I have some issues with Christianity, it isn't for me. I have strong reservations about Christianity, have no interest in it. I am passionately opposed to Christianity. Now here's the interesting thing. Most of us think that people within the community who don't go to church, don't call themselves Christians, would have strong reservations about Christianity and have no interest and are passionately opposed. So the question is, where does everybody sit? Now, in 2021, this survey was done across 2,000 Australians, and it was lined up across the demographics of Australia. And so it's not just Sydney, it's all over the country, and it was done online. McCrindle did this research, and it can be seen as reasonable and trustworthy research. So, those that are warm, where do they sit? 27% in 21 and 24% in 2017. So 27% of people in this country are warm towards faith. Now, if we just stop there, if you add those two numbers up, you get 64% of Australians who would actually be either call themselves a Christian or be quite warm towards you talking about faith and belief. Now, that ought to encourage you. 6 out of 10 people that you would talk to actually sit either where you sit or are actually positively disposed to what you're talking about. There is enormous opportunity. If 16% of Australians are going to church, you therefore have 48% of the population who are not far from what you hold to, and would probably, as we'll get to, would probably respond to an invitation. There is huge opportunity. Now, in the kind of middle space, 12% hasn't changed over the last 2 years. Now, so what percentage is left that are those that are angry and upset? 25% and 26%. Again, it's not shifting. So what we see is when people say, like it's a godless country, nobody goes to church and nobody's interested in Christian faith, that is simply not true. And you should point that out to people who say it, that it's simply not true. So what about, and then this whole cool towards Christianity. So if you take that question about being cool towards Christianity, if you were born in Australia, 28% were cool towards Christianity. If you were born overseas, only 17% are cool towards Christianity. So you are more likely to be warm to it. So this idea again, if you're born overseas, born in a nation that's not a Christian nation, you'll be cold towards Christianity. Not the case. We asked the question about, so here's the attractors and repellents. We didn't do this in 2021. We asked this question in 2016-17, but I thought I'd put it up here for your interest. So if you were, it's this whole question about what would attract you to Christianity or what would repel you from Christianity. And what's really interesting is the top repellents. Here they are. Philosophical discussions debating ideas, miraculous stories, or hearing from public figures and celebrities who are examples of that faith. We actually call this the Tom Cruise effect. Tom Cruise, there's not a lot of people lining up to his faith just because he's a great actor. So one of the things that we need to keep in mind, because he's, what's the name of that faith again? Scientology, thank you. I just had this mental block on it. So he's well known as the leading kind of exponent publicly of Scientology, but not everybody's joining Scientology because of Tom Cruise. And what do people want to see? They want to see people living out a genuine faith, people experience personal trauma or a life event, and stories and testimonies from people that have changed due to their faith. They just want real people telling real stories that are genuine people, not celebrities pushing an idea. Now, you've got to keep this in balance. When I was running Guy Meir a number of years ago, clearly, we had Elka Wayland come. Now, Elka Wayland won a silver medal in 2 Olympics in swimming. And so we had her come to a Sunday morning service. It was a pack-out. In fact, we got her to go and do something in our children's program and then come and speak to our main church service. One of the ladies from our church invited kids from the local swimming school, and there's like 20 kids from the local swimming school who wanted to come and meet Elka Wayland. And so, that if there's a celebrity kind of personality, people are kind of interested in them as a person, and that builds some profile in what you're trying to do. But that doesn't mean they'll all just rush to become Christians because Elka Wayland is a Christian or that Tom Cruise is into Scientology. So there's the attractors and repellents. Moving on, what are the belief blockers or the issue blockers? So we looked at this in 2 ways. We were trying to ask, what are the things that block you from faith? And this won't surprise you, but here are the top belief blockers. Homosexuality, hell and damnation, suffering, supernatural elements, role of women, the Bible, and science and evolution. These are people who aren't Christians. We're asked, what are the Christian beliefs that block you most? And that's where they sit. This demonstrates that the homosexuality issue is a huge issue. Now that may change over time, but at the moment it's a massive issue. The next was behavioural blockers, what's happened within the church. And again, no surprise, we talked about this last night, church abuse, and I think hypocrisy and church abuse actually fit together. Interestingly, religious wars is up there, which is bizarre because godless atheistic regimes killed 120 million people in the 20th century, and Christian faith and religious wars didn't actually start that many wars, but there's this idea in people's minds, judging others and issues around money. Now, what we get out of those two, the issue blockers and the behavioural blockers, is this idea that everybody's angry about Christianity, they don't like Christians, and they all just think they're hypocrites, etc. And you'll hear that a lot. In fact, I sat in a conference where the person speaking before me quoted Barnard research out of America that said, Barnard did research of Americans and they think Christians are all judgmental and hypocritical. And everybody in the room went, oh, it's terrible, because that's what you all believe. If I said that to you, there was research in Australia that said Australians think that Christians are all hypocritical and judgmental. You would probably go, yeah, that's what they think, and this sort of points to that. Well, the question is that the case? And we did this research, and we've done this twice, and the research was, do you know somebody who's a Christian? And basically, 92% of Australians know a Christian. We didn't say, can you give a theological definition of the person you've just called a Christian? But 92% say they know a Christian. So in other words, 8% don't know any Christians. And then what we did was we gave them, Adam, quickly, what time am I finishing? I didn't bring my sheet up and I didn't take note of it. Okay. Sorry? Is lunch. 11:45 is lunch, so we have Q&A, so, okay. Great. So I'm doing great. I'm doing good. That's good. Thank you. I'll be much more professional in the next session. I'll look it up before I stand up. So then we basically gave them 20 options. 20 options, and the 20 options were 10 of them were positive and 10 of them were negative. So if you know a Christian, of the Christians you describe, I think it was 3 options, what 3 words best describe the Christians that you know? And keeping in mind that judgmental and hypocritical and all those words were on the list. So here is the top 5 words that Australians use to describe the Christians that they know. Caring, kind, honest, loving, generous. That's what the community think of the Christians that they know. This is not somebody commentating. This is actual research of 2,000 Australians, and that's the outcome. Look at the bottom 5. Intolerant, insensitive, authoritarian, exclusive and rude. They were all on the list. They just didn't get into the top 5. Now, just in case you think, well, that's probably bad research, Karl, but good on you for making us feel good. I think there's a group in England that actually heard our research or read our research, because they actually asked almost exactly the same question, and they've done this twice. And there's a group and they've done a bit of research called Talking Jesus. Now, you can look it up online. You can download 42 pages for free if you want to. I think it's something like 40 pages. But it's Talking Jesus. And they've done the same sort of research in England. So when they asked the same question in England, here was the top responses. Caring, friendly, good-humoured and generous. The bottom responses, hypocritical and narrow-minded, are there, but they're the bottom responses. So in the UK, and this was just released this year, so this has been done in the last 6 months. So what you see is the same, but here's what they did in the UK that we didn't do. They asked that question about the Christians that they know. Then they asked the question about the church global, and this is the response they got. Hypocritical and narrow-minded and homophobic ended up some of the largest responses. Now, caring was up there at 20%, friendly was up there at 22%. But you'll notice the difference between these two scales when you ask about the people that you know, as in concrete, and you ask about the institutions, as in abstract. And there's a very big difference between what people think about the concrete that they know and experience and the abstract that they think about as a big picture. And in the abstract, in some pretty awful situations, it's been worse. Now, intriguingly, I think, here's my prophetic word, but you'll dismiss it because I'm a Baptist, so that's okay. But church abuse will I think, disappear off the agenda. That period of time where there were little controls, too much kind of belief in that people will do the right thing, and the notion of extending forgiveness and protecting the institution, those days are gone. It doesn't mean that it won't happen, it will happen. But everybody is so much more vigilant these days, so much more focused, and with no bandwidth to allow that to happen. My prophetic word is in 10 to 20 years' time, that will be seen as an awful time in history, and we've moved on from it. And so some of these numbers will drop or change because that is not going to be what it was. The issue around the LGBTIQ community, that will rise. That will only get more and more difficult. But around abuse within church, that will fall away as an issue, I believe. Recognise the positive impact of the church. So again, here's this notion of is the church having a positive impact. So if you're in advocating women's rights, if you were born overseas, you saw the church had a 73% positive impact. If you were born in Australia, it was only 63%. Developing leaders of good character, 80% if you were born overseas, 71% if you were born in Australia. So what's the theme you see here? If you were born overseas, and you actually experience some pretty awful regimes, or countries like India and China that really don't have good safety nets for people who are in need, who really are quite misogynistic about how they treat women. For all the talk about Australia being a bad place for women, it's probably one of the best in the world, actually. And where other regimes, as we've already said, around Afghanistan at the moment, is absolutely diabolical for women. So for all the criticism that the church isn't what it should be, it's actually helped create a nation with a much better opportunity, and people who are born overseas are more likely to see that than people within Australia. I think I'm getting towards the end. It's one of those things where I can't memorise all my 38 slides, so you'll forgive me for that. But it's good news that we're close to the end, Adam. Here's a really interesting piece, which is when we're talking about gospel and we're talking about sharing the message of Jesus, and we're talking about what do Australians think of Christianity in the church. This was from the NCLS survey. So the question was, which of the following roles do you think religious groups, in other words churches, should fulfil? What should they do? So if churches are in the community, what do you reckon they should do? Now look at the top ones: conduct weddings, create good morals, support the poor, provide worship services, give meaning and dedication to life, provide public social services. All wonderful. Guess what the challenge is? Look at the second bottom one, if you can read it. The third bottom one, really. Convert people to faith. Isn't that interesting? I think the bottom one's great, isn't it? Give public comment on political issues. Nobody's real keen to see that. Just delete that political statement you're about to send to the paper, Adam. It's not going to work. But now, mind you, I think we should do it, but it's how we do it, and it's not saying we shouldn't have a place there. But I reckon this, convert people to faith, is a really significant issue. And one of the issues that's connected to that is actually for the millennial generation. So they've done research in America around millennial Christians in America. And when asked, the millennial Christians in America, my wife gave me a hard time for saying this, so I'm about to tell you something my wife told me I shouldn't say, but she's not here, so here I go. Essentially, when asked, can you answer questions about faith, millennials, 73%, yes. You remember when you were 25, you knew everything, So no problem about answering questions, no problem about defending faith. Yes, we can do all of that. Should Christians talk about their faith? Should Christians be involved in evangelism? 47% no. Think about that. 47% of a generation of Christians coming through actually think we shouldn't do evangelism. And part of that is related to this, because I think they get the vibes from their friends that they don't want to hear about this anymore, actually, that they don't want to talk about faith. Now, it's what we said at the end of that last session in the Q&A. It's about how we approach that discussion. And I think we need to redeem gospel ministry within the church. One of our goals as Olive Tree Media, and one of the things that we say one of our purposes is to redeem the gospel by word within the church. Because what's happened in the discussion between gospel as deed and gospel as word is that deed has won that argument. And everybody's doing deed. They're all going to Cambodia, they're digging water wells, they're all going to Ukraine to support them. They're all doing all these wonderful deed things. And guess what? Fantastic. Big tick in the box. That's exactly what we should be doing. But not at the detriment of word. When was the last time you saw a conference like this on evangelism and the gospel? Like, really? They almost don't exist anymore. And it's this whole notion that it's just dropped off the agenda. And it's dropped off the agenda because, you know what, if you talk to your neighbour, you're chatting to your neighbour who's just a normal average person who doesn't go to church but knows you do, like my mate Harry that I talked to you about before, and they said to you, what are you doing next week? I said, I'm going overseas. Where are you going overseas? I'm going to Cambodia. What are you going to do in Cambodia? Well, I'm digging water wells to give them better health outcomes because that's better for them, better for their family, better for the community. What do you reckon they're going to say? That's fantastic. I'll give you some money to help you go. That's probably what they'll say. But if you say, if they say, what are you doing? I'm going to Cambodia. What are you going to Cambodia for? Because we're going to actually talk about Jesus and help more Cambodians come to know Jesus personally. What do you reckon the response to that is going to be? There's either silence is but you know what's going on in their head? Should you be going there? Isn't that colonialism? Are you putting your religion onto them? Is that what you really should be doing? And because of that, you know, when you're congratulated by everybody for doing this, you are more likely to do it than when you do something that other people are annoyed by. And, you know, as a church, the gospel is not virtue signaling to non-Christian friends by doing good things so they feel we're okay. The gospel is about reminding people of their need for Jesus. That's what the gospel is. And it's not popular. And it's not easy. And it's a challenge. But unless we find our way into it, we are one generation from losing it. We need to redeem the gospel. And we need to recognise that this is an issue and respond to it. Last, I think this is my last one. 1 in 3 Australians are likely to go to church if invited by a close friend. Now, intriguingly, here's this notion, and notice that within this question, on the top right-hand corner, apart from such special occasions as weddings, funerals, etc., would you go to a Christian church service invited by a close friend or family member? And 31% of Australians are saying they would go. And what's interesting is if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, 18 to 34-year-olds are more as likely to do it as anybody else. And what we saw earlier is that age bracket has done that more in the last 10 years than any other age bracket. And what NCLS are pointing out is people will come if you invite them. And people are ready. Now, some of you are thinking, now, this is not true of your church, Adam, because everyone would be quite positive about bringing people to your church. But there are those, so this is just a generalised comment, this is not a comment about some buts, but there are those who think, I'm going to invite people to my church, what if they come? Gee, you know, not so good. You know what's wrong with that statement? That most people in the community have lower expectations about what's going to happen when they turn up at church than you have. They're expecting it to be really bad, actually. And when it's not, it's like, wow, this is not bad. What do people want? They want to belong. That's what I was saying before. They want somewhere to belong. And in COVID, what's COVID telling us? They're asking more questions about their mortality, their future, what's going to happen to them. They're actually Googling prayer more than they ever have. 64% or 62% of Australians are actually positively disposed to where you stand. And there's about 21% of Australians live by themselves in a house with nobody else there. And a further around 23% live in a house where there's just one other person. Now that could be fantastic because you're most happy with the other person. Or you're desperate for friends. The piece of research I think I mentioned earlier, that was in the paper yesterday, 47% of Australians say they feel lonely. Inviting people to be a part of a community of faith is one of the best opportunities that we have right now to be a gospel opportunity within the communion. And what we do is when we have this pointless argument where we talk about, as I said before, should we go out and, be incarnational in the community or invite people in? And there's this idea that, inviting people in is a bad idea. I actually saw a video where a guy who was a church leader who's in Western Australia doing some, trendy church thing, and he said, Jesus, did you ever notice Jesus inviting people to the synagogue? He never did that. He went out and talked to people. That is seriously bad exegesis and a dumb example. Like, really? Come on. What is that? And when we believe that stuff, we shoot ourselves in the foot as a church, because the best opportunity we have is just invite people in and care for them. That's a fantastic opportunity. People are ready, people are open, people are warm, and people are lonely. There's a chance for the gospel. And you don't have to be a superstar church with the best show in town, even though clearly St. Bart's is. But you don't have to be that to do that. Just invite people and help them be a part of your community. Thank you.
Thanks, Karl. Well, we've had lots of questions. You can keep texting them through if you like, and we'll see how many we get through. So where should we start? Let's start here. So regarding the census statistics, before 1960, do you think the population was truly Christian?
Yeah.
So some sort of personal confession
I'm nodding
of faith,
because it's a good question.
Or just a cultural institution.
Yeah, it is. I mean, one of the things that people say, one of the ladies said, Sally, I think I talked about the 1959 Billy Graham crusade. And the 59 Billy Graham crusade, a lot of people say that it had enormous impact because it was converting the nominal. So it's a bit like saying, so 38% of Australians in the census tick a Christian box. And we're all thinking, well, they're not really Christian, really. And that's, technically, that's kind of probably true. All it's given you is an indication of their warmth towards it. My point is, the question is right, and I think I would agree with that. In what we would call a Christian, that 96% of Australians weren't Christian in what we would call a Christian. But all it says is there was and when you say it's a cultural hangover, yeah, but gosh, it's a pretty significant cultural hangover, isn't it? That's where people sit. So the people are warm and open. So that's how I read that. It's not saying we were all Christian. It was saying there was a wider acceptance of faith and belief within the community. And I think we need to also be careful about not judging everybody. The person ticks a box. It's almost like you're sitting over their shoulder and they tick the Christian box and you go, that's not right. You're not a Christian. So that's not our job. Really, that's not our job. But what it says is they're open and warm to learn more. So that's what I would say.
Mm. Mentioned from the research that one of the greatest barriers to Christianity is religious war.
Yeah.
Why do you think recent and still very much in living memory and experience of abuse will dissipate in 20 years if religious war, which has been relatively minimal, has not dissipated?
I don't know. I'm not sure the answer to that. I think it's kind of like something that's sort of bubbled through history, and certainly the 1500s religious wars were absolutely awful, and there's been plenty of them. I think the other thing about religious wars, I think they took a jump around the 2001 attack on the World Trade Centers. Because religion wars is not just Christian, it's religious. And when you have the Taliban doing what they do in Afghanistan, and remember before all this happened, 5 years ago, we were spending all of our time thinking about or worrying about ISIS, who said they were going to take over the world, and this was a religious jihad and a religious war. So there is the sort of cultural hangover of the Christian wars, but also you've got a whole bunch of those pushing religious wars from an Islamic point of view. And that's where Richard Dawkins, there's a very famous quote about Richard Dawkins after the 9/11 attack saying, I'm over being nice to religious people. This is really, religion is a terrible thing. And then at the time, the late Christopher Hitchens wrote, God is not good, why religion poisons everything. And those two things were running in tandem. But religion then was not just Christian faith, although it was a key part of their thinking. There was also the wider other faiths that were acting in a warlike fashion.
Mm. When you served at Gaimea, did you witness in that time a shift in the priority of conversionary gospel proclamation?
We tried to help that. Absolutely. And one of the things that we did as a church in my leadership over that time was to make sure that we were doing lots of little gospel opportunities, like the fact that you're running Alpha this next week. We'd run Alpha courses. And I think one of the things that the churches should do in conversionary, and we had numbers of people who would come along and find faith in quite remarkable ways. And what we would do is we would encourage people to talk to their friends. We would encourage people to invite. We would make sure we used, like, for instance, services like Christmas, Easter, Mother's Day, those days, use those days, do something special and get people to invite their friends. And I don't know if you find it here, you're probably much more spiritual than us, but Mother's Day is a huge service, Father's Day, not so much. So when mums get the opportunity, They say, what do you want on Mother's Day? Come to church. And everybody goes, okay. Father's Day, what do you want to do? Let's go somewhere else. So little kind of issue there. Maybe it was just the fathers in our church. But so it was that. And then we would give people, we would very regularly, not every service, ask people to respond to Jesus. And we would proclaim the gospel as much as we could. And we would multiply options through the year. And one of your best opportunities is around Christmas carols, those sorts of celebrations, and then do something that invited people out of those times. So it's multiplying options and just giving people the opportunity. And then as you build a reputation for that, I remember this cracking story of a lady that she just started turning up. And I don't know how to say this, but when she turned up, she dressed in a way you just thought, that's why you come to a Baptist church all the time, So it wasn't terrible. It was just like, okay, that's a fairly unique outfit. And then she would always leave very early. Like she would just leave the service, like straight away. And I was walking through one of the parks near the beach one day, and I heard somebody yelled out to me, and it was her. And we just had this conversation, this warm, positive conversation. And two things about that conversation. I said, so why do you leave so soon? Like, why do you? She said, oh, Karl, it's just so embarrassing. I cry through the whole service. Now, just keep this in mind. Like, we think we're not sure that people are going to like the service. We have become dulled as Christians to the spiritual and emotional impact that worship can have in people's lives. Not because it's the greatest show in town with the best band. It's just the notion that there's something going on here beyond my normal experience. And people often, new to church, cry through church because it just feels overwhelming. And I said, so why'd you start coming? She said, well, I grew up a Catholic, and once Easter I was going off to the Catholic church, and I thought to myself, I just can't do it again. Where else can I go? I'm going to try that Gymea Baptist. She just turned up. And so profiling yourself, when people have those thoughts, I'm not saying that we're better than the Catholics, but she needed something that was different for her life. So long answer to a short question. Great
answer, thanks. So given some of the stats around, we're a nation that is incredibly shaped by immigration and the openness of those from other countries to Christianity, how should local churches be more mindful of other cultures when sharing the good news?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm an expert in how to answer that question, other than to say that if you are new to the country, you are desperate to connect, and you're also desperate to connect with some people from your own cultural background. So creating opportunities where they can gather. Many churches, we never did as Gymea Baptist. I know that in Sydney a lot of Anglican churches do it, but the whole ESL thing, English as a second language, really important opportunity. And because it's learning English, but it's somewhere to belong. Again, this is going to sound like an ad, but one of the episodes in the new series is actually on immigration. And one of the people we interview is Rosemary Kariuki, who won the Local Hero Australian of the Year 2021. This fabulous African woman. And as she turned up here, and she's like, she gets shuffled into a unit in Bondi, and she's like, where are all the Africans? And also, why do people not talk to each other? So she wrote all these cards and put it in all of the letterboxes, which is, my name's Rosemary, I'm in unit number 3. I'd like to meet some people. So she just started to interact with people. And she won the Local Hero of the Award because that's her heart. And she's supporting and caring for and looking after many of the African and Middle Eastern ladies that come to this country. So there's heaps of opportunity there. And it's basically, I don't know what Toowoomba's like. I didn't do the research on your numbers or your immigration levels, but there'd be great cohorts of people in this nation, in this city. And if you're thinking, they won't be interested because they come from those nations, what the stats are showing is that, of course, they're interested and they're looking to belong. So, help them be a part of you as a church. Don't just secrete them off in their own little group. But also, so two things about that. Also, look for opportunities where people can gather, where people from their own culture, just so that they feel at home. But also just be mindful about what you say and how you approach stuff. And one of the things I used to say, this is more a conversation between Adam and I, but just for all of you, that there's an interesting, I used to say to my staff and our staff, and we would discuss this, I want you to imagine that somebody walked into the service halfway through the first hymn or song or worship song and left halfway through the last one. So in other words, personal welcome wasn't part of the welcoming process. All it was is they just came in and sat in a service. What do we say and do that makes them feel welcome without doing the whole, if you're new, stand up and say your name? Do you do that here?
No.
Okay, great. Because I was about to say something that...
Great check though, Karl.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was about to say something that may not play out very well.
Definitely not.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, because that is the dumbest thing to do in the world. And the other thing too is to assume that everybody wants to be overwhelmed when they walk through that door. You know what a lot of people want? They want to sit at the back, they want to take it all in, they want to be left alone. Now, so what do you do to make them feel welcome? And it's all about language, it's all about what you say, it's all about how you introduce everything that goes on. Pretend there's a whole bunch of people that really don't get what you're doing. So when you're introducing it in a way that they feel included.
It's really interesting that many of the indicators of openness to Christianity in the UK are very similar to what's reported in the AU, Australia.
Yeah.
Yet, in UK, there seem to be significant signs of growth, especially in the south. What do you think is happening?
African churches. Essentially, African. Like the growth in London in churches is basically black churches. Like that's the growth. So that's one thing to say, and no one should lose. That's just a comment about what's happening. There's nothing racial about that or judgmental about it. That's just the facts. But you've also got a number of churches with a really keen focus on evangelism, and they're working hard at it, and that's seeing growth. And that's certainly around HTB, and it's certainly around the church replanting that happens around HTB. So that's Holy Trinity Brompton. They started the Alpha course, but the Alpha course is a small part of what they do. And so, for instance, we interviewed a guy called Jago Wynne, who actually runs the church that John Thornton, remember I was talking about William Wilberforce, John Thornton, the Clapham sect? Well, in the middle of Clapham Common, takes up, it's one of those things where you look at it and you go, who agreed to that? You would never do that today. Here's this great big green Clapham Common, and right in one corner is this massive church. But that's built by John Thornton. And the person who went there was William Wilberforce. So it's a really significant church, Holy Trinity Clapham. That church was not doing particularly well. Holy Trinity Brompton sent a guy called Jago Wynne with a team to Holy Trinity Clapham, and they've replanted the church, and the church is now growing, and that's happening all over London. So you're getting some really significant growth, but don't miss that a lot of the growth is happening in majority black churches, which is having a really significant impact.
Thanks, Karl. Would you like to thank Karl once again?
Yeah, good on you guys. Thank you. Fabulous.